Hello again and welcome to ISAC Software Academy Linux course. This lesson will be covering the important files and directories in Linux, what they're for, how they can be different amongst different distributions, and what you can do about that. Now, Linux has many different but common files and directories between all of the different distributions. They may not always be in the same locations, but they are in fact common amongst them. These distributions that change their locations are generally as a result of what they've been based off of. As an example, you'll find a slight difference in the location of common files and directories between a Slackware-based distribution and a Debian-based distribution. As we are dealing entirely with Ubuntu distributions, that's exactly what we will be covering the locations for. However, it is always a good thing to keep in mind that anything that is not based off of Debian or specifically Ubuntu could very possibly have a different location for these files or directories. And this can cause some slight incompatibilities between the two systems. This happens because of the fact that if you try to access a file or directory that is not in that location directly, rather than by, for example, an environment variable in a program, it will simply fail. As a result, this can be one of the reasons that when you, for example, install from source, it doesn't work on your system because it cannot find the file or directory that it requires to run. Knowing these differences can help to debug and run certain applications or programs in general. However, sometimes it's just simply not possible without rewriting the code, which is obviously beyond the scope of this lesson. However, that is always a possibility if you have the technical skill of programming at your disposal. One of the most important locations in a Linux file system is the /etc or /etc. This directory houses a lot of configuration files. Pretty much every configuration file that you're going to want or need access to is more than likely going to be in the /etc directory. Now, obviously, etc sounds very familiar because in fact it is the abbreviation for etc, which is pretty much because it hosts various configuration files, so that's its link to the name. But generally speaking, you won't hear people reference it as the etc directory. You might find somebody who does, but it's generally pronounced etsy amongst Linux enthusiasts and users. Some people will simply spell out etc each time. However, it's entirely up to you how you wish to go about it. Another directory to be aware of is the /home directory. Now, this directory houses the files for users. For example, if you have the username of ISAC, which our system does, you can in fact go to /home/ISAC, and there is a directory there that is the ISAC user's home directory. And this is the case for all usable users on the system except for the root user, who is in the /root directory. That's something to be mindful of if you, for whatever reason, needed to be logged in as root on a specific system and it was saved a file in the home directory and you were root, you would need to go to /root, not /home. So something to keep in mind. Now there are also the /usr, which is user, /var, which is /variable, that's what it stands for, and the /bin directories, which is binary. These are obviously important folders, otherwise they wouldn't be there, and these directories are used for various things. The /user directory is generally for user files, but not always. You can find files in there that don't really belong to a user. It comes down to the developer of particular applications that are installed as to where they will put their files. Now generally there is a consensus among most developers of where to put them, however not everybody agrees, and therefore they will put them in strange places sometimes. Now this can be checked by various methods, but generally speaking anything with bin in the name generally is not to be thought of as the trash. It is in fact binary, meaning executable, and as such all the executables will generally be in the /bin directory. There are other binary directories however, and you should be aware of that. The /boot directory is, as I say here, arguably the most important directory. This is where the kernel image is stored that is booted when the system first loads. So it's pretty much the entry point for loading up the system. Without that directory, and in some installations there is no /boot directory, so this is something to keep in mind, but on our installations there is a /boot directory and it is used to boot the system image. The grub bootloader is also housed here. It's the /boot/grub folder, and depending upon how it was done you'll probably find a great many files in that particular directory. The /dev directory is something that we have covered before, only briefly. It's a storehouse that houses all the files that are linked to devices. Now the devices in a Linux system are referenced as files, and these files are the ones in the /dev directory. It's predominantly used by mount and umount, however there are other applications, and I have myself from time to time had to look up a device ID by simply listing out the devices in there, sometimes even manually reading through the entire list, which is huge, which we will get into shortly. But this is a way that you can actually go about finding out what the device ID is of a device that you want to use. Now, before we move into the practical side of this lesson, the /etc/CPU info file lists information about your CPU. This can be useful if, for example, you want to compile something that requires a certain chipset or instruction set, and you don't know if your CPU supports it, so you can find out that way. It can also be used for debugging purposes if that seems to be one of the causes for a problem. Now the /etc/password and /etc/shadow files are password files. They both serve a different purpose. The password file houses the username, optionally an encrypted version of the password, and various other details like the home directory and the shell that you wish to use, as the bash shell is not the only one available, however it's the most common. The /etc/shadow file, on the other hand, usually if shadowing is enabled, what happens is that all of that information is in the password file, but the encrypted password itself is actually replaced by simply an X, and the shadow file actually contains the encrypted password instead. As a result of this, it makes it more secure, because applications that need to access the password file for specific reasons, like finding out where your user directory is, for example, your home directory is, then they don't need to be privy to the encrypted password. So they can actually be blocked from the shadow password but not the password file. So that's a security measure that was introduced. And last but not least, before we get into the practical, is the /etc/hosts file. Now, you might be familiar with the hosts file in a Windows system, and it does effectively the exact same thing on a Linux system, and this is just where it resides. So you can put in network aliases there for your local network, or perhaps even for commonly visited online locations as well. Now we will be actually exploring some of the Linux system now. Now I'm going to go to the top level directory, the root directory. Now, this is not to be confused with the root user. The root directory is an almost universal term to describe the top level of a file system, and as such everything starts from slash and goes down from there. Now that's a / here, so that's something to keep in mind as well, because a backslash will not work. However, that should have been covered earlier. It's now being covered. It is / is the top level directory, so just keep that in mind. Now if we do a listing, we can see some of those ones that I was mentioning earlier, the /bin, /boot, /dev, /etc, /home. Now obviously all of these don't actually have a slash in front of them. This is actually what is referred to as an absolute file path, and it is used to reference the exact location rather than what you can also call a relative path. And in a relative path, this is where you would type, as an example, say I was in the home directory. The relative path for me to get into my user home directory is to type in simply cd isac. Now that puts me in my home directory. However, I can also have done this by going, say for example I was already in the boot directory and I wanted to go directly there. I can go cd/ and then home and then isac, and that would be directly into my home directory from wherever I am, because it's an absolute path. The other way to do that is when you are in fact back here, we can go cd ... meaning one up, then / then home, then isac, and it'll do the exact same thing. One is an absolute, which is the first one there. The other is a relative. Now relative means relative to your current location, so that's where I will be mentioning that a little bit more, so something to keep in mind. Now in the /boot directory, I can show you these are the files that are available here that are kernel images. These are all options that pop up when I start up the system. This is the general one that will actually be used pretty much all the time. Sorry, that's actually the old one. There was an update. That's the one that's used now. There is other options here, which some of them I'm not even sure what they're used for, except for diagnostic purposes. As an example, the memtest86 one here is specifically for testing memory. The initRD one is for init meaning initialize, so that's there. So there's many options here, and this is where you can change that. Now there's also the grub directory that I mentioned, and as you can see there are a lot of files in here. Now generally speaking, there's only a few you'll need to worry about in here. You generally won't need to worry about all of them. There are some exceptions to it, but as you can see with this many, you sort of want to avoid as much as possible. There used to be, but I believe they've removed it, a conf file. Yeah, it doesn't seem like it exists anymore, that you could actually modify in this directory. Now they've probably moved it out to probably the etc directory, because that's the most common place for configuration files, and we'll be going there now. But it was a way for you to modify your boot options, so that's something we'll try and find that file soon. Now the etc directory, I am going to do this with a pipe more, as there is a lot of files in here, as you can see. Now there are a lot of different things in here. As an example, there's an ACPI directory. Now you'll note that the coloring that you get from using the ls command is not available when you pipe it through the more command. It's unfortunate, but you can work around it. You just need to keep in mind that the D over here means directory. Obviously you've got the anachron table there. All sorts of things are in here. There is the cron.d. These things are all run scripts in them, so they're in here. The cron tab itself, cron.weekly, that's down a little bit lower. There's DHCP configuration options in there, fstab, a lot of things we've covered before here. Obviously we've got some initialization files in here as well for when the system is initializing. Our Java that we've installed, the KDE files are in here as well. So you also find GNOME files and things like that. There's all sorts of things in here. If you're looking for a configuration file, it's almost certainly going to be in the /etc directory, and quite often it's actually in a file in etc itself rather than a subdirectory. There is the password file I mentioned earlier. If we go down probably one more, there's the shadow file that I mentioned. There's also a sudo-as file, which could come in handy later on for if you need to add a user to the sudo-as file so that they can actually sudo. Thunderbird email client there that can house some configuration and probably hopefully encrypted emails. And that should be the end of it. Now I'll just show you the /etc/password file so you can get an understanding of what I was talking about earlier. As an example, here's the user account for the account I'm into at the moment. Now as you can see, that's the username there, ISAC, and there is an X where the password should be. Now the user and group ID there is 1000, and the name that I've given this account is ISAC Software Academy, and then you have the home folder or directory, and then the /bin/bash means that that's the shell account that it uses. You'll note that there are some accounts here that you wouldn't think existed. These accounts are actually not used by people, they're used by, as an example, daemons or some sort of application. So these are listed with a /bin/false, so since false does not exist, so that way you cannot actually run a shell with them. Now if I show you the shadow file that we have also mentioned, as I mentioned earlier, you actually require the permissions to access it. So there you go, you can now see all of these don't really have anything there, but then there's the encrypted password here, which is rather long for a 4-character password, but obviously you couldn't tell that from looking at it. And that's how that works. It matches it up, it sees ISAC, and then it sees the password, and then it looks it up, and that's how it knows which password's which. The /user directory is one that is generally used rather randomly by applications. As you can see, it's got a few things in it. It has a bin directory, obviously for binaries. Games can be installed here. There are include files and libraries. It's generally just whatever the user wants to install, it goes into the /user directory. That's the general consensus, but there are many people that disagree with that, so it's to be kept in mind. There is also the Var Command, command directory, and this has much more technical stuff. Obviously you can keep backups in there. Obviously you can keep anything you want anywhere, but this is more of a general rule that is for the most part agreed upon. You have a spooling directory there for spooling for your printing and whatnot. There's a games directory here as well. As I said, not everybody agrees, so your games go in here as well. You can also have applications that go into multiple directories. Now this happens fairly often actually, where one file for that program will be in the var directory, the other file is in the sbin directory, and another file again is in the etc directory. And that's because the purpose of those files each has a different purpose and therefore goes in a different location, and that's why it's segregated in that fashion. As you can see, there's quite a lot in there. The one I will mention very quickly before we finish up here is the temp directory. It is not wise to keep anything in the temp directory, as it is a temporary directory, for obviously by the name. This can get wiped automatically by certain applications. Quite often it's set up to do so, so don't try to put anything in there that you want to keep a hold of. There's a good chance it might get wiped out. Anyway, that is everything for this lesson. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.